War is declared on the 4th of August 1914, and some of the first to enlist are Queenslanders, those of the 2nd Light Horse Regiment.
These men are very keen to be seen at the forefront of that enlistment process. Many of the men who joined that particular regiment would have been country boys.
Their ability to ride would have been as basic as their ability to walk. They have bush skills, the ability to live off the land.
They were the encapsulation of a marriage between the idea of the romantic bushman on the horse, clans to the overflow and that kind of stuff, along with the military figure.
Many of them felt they were off on an adventure, it'd be over before Christmas and they'd be home. They really weren't aware of the privations that they were going to be going through over the next 5 years.
The 2nd Light Horse Regiment set off on the troop ship Star of England, headed for Egypt.
The men are well and behaving splendidly, although some of the horses are ill. I'm afraid we may lose a few. The New Zealanders were sent in first, aboard the Omra and others. Of course, preference should have been given to the boats with the horses.
They were now in Egypt and some of the biblical lands that they would have read about in their Bibles, and now they were there.
They would have felt that they could prove themselves as men. That's a very strong idea that I think prevails through the writing. Very tough training in the heat of the Egyptian desert. It would have been exhausting for many of them and not much fun, so that would have wiped them out. They would have had some downtime though.
There has been a little painting things red, but nothing to justify the comments I've read in the Australian newspapers.
A subtext in Bourne's letters is that what you're seeing here is the colonial process being reenacted. So even if there's a photo at one point where British and Australian officers are standing and looking out across a group of Egyptians, and you have the sense that they are the ruling class.
Measles and pneumonia are commonplace. I've seen men die here in Cairo before they've even set foot on the front lines. Somebody should be hanged for this state of affairs. We're fit to work and we're impatient to be at it.
Finally, the 2nd Light Horsemen are sent off to Gallipoli, leaving their horses behind.
Well, we left Alexandria on the evening of the 9th. Well-trained light horsemen turned into infantrymen with 3 days' notice. We had very vague ideas of the general situation. Lieutenant Sherry, who was leaving on the bulwark next to me, remarked, "We're hanging on by our eyebrows, Sol." It was an exact appreciation of the situation.
Green is an Anglican military chaplain who's actually attached to the 2nd Light Horse. His diaries are fascinating because when you read them, you could be quite convinced that he's not actually a chaplain.
It was our B squadron who were in the line behind Major G.H. Bourne. Incredible fellow. Lieutenant Boyd had been in the trenches not 3 minutes when he started retaliation with his revolver above the parapet. His forearm was shot through and afterwards amputated. He saw no more war.
They had this image that they were the superior soldiers. What actually happens when they get there is that some of the infantrymen who are already there do make disparaging comments about them, and they say things like, "Oh, you know, you're no good without your horses, no good without your GGs," I think at one point.
Yeah, well, this coming from the men of the 4th Infantry Brigade, with whom we have had some rivalry, but we could handle their cheek. We're proud to be in the Light Horse. And it wasn't very long after that that the men of the 4th Infantry Brigade acknowledged us worthy to fight by them.
When they're moved back from the front line, they are still subject to bombardment, sniping and all that kind of thing.
And then of course you then end up with this 8 months of protracted trench warfare where they've had to put up with the dust and the heat and the flies and then the lice.
The valour, spirit, patience and determination of these Australian soldiers are beyond all praise. The extent of their heroism will not be known for many a day. They have achieved wonders.
And there's a very clear evidence in Bourne's case that when he's first in combat, he makes a very important decision not to send a second wave of troops up into Queen's Post because the first wave has just been slaughtered. Bourne decides there's no point sending a second wave. This is clearly a rational decision by a man who is in touch with what's going on. He's a very capable soldier.
The Queensland battalions have distinguished themselves greatly, but their casualty list will stagger Australia. The whole valley is drenched with the blood of Australia's best.
That was their first wake-up call to this really was the reality of warfare.
The health risks are enormous. Bourne is actually evacuated with dysentery, and these men are suffering physically. They actually have a truce to bury the bodies, then they go back to fight. So you can imagine this is a particular version of hell.
Letters from home were savoured by all the men on the front lines, and many soldiers wrote back to family in Queensland.
One of the important differentiations between Green's diary and Bourne's letters, Green's diary is obviously collected at some later point. He's kept it as a record for himself. Bourne's letters are to another reader, largely his mother, who's protecting her from certain things. And he also knows they're going to be censored. So he can't really talk about some of the horrors, even if he wanted to.
The 2nd Light Horse Regiment finally withdrew from Gallipoli in December 1915.
It's reported in the press as being this brilliant British military achievement. You know, say, actually, no, it was a retreat, and we lost.
But in the Battle of Romani in 1916, the Allies have a rare win.
It's been a most strenuous fortnight. In fact, until 5 a.m. on the 4th, we bore the full brunt of the battle. We got it pretty thick at Bir El Abad on the 9th, but we came out of this scrap ahead of the game. 2 of my own horses were killed. My splendid brown horse, hit by a piece of high explosive. It's a huge blow.
The times when you have got this bond between the horse and the man, and they had to train together and work together. The soldiers would often be snuggled up in the horse blanket that was soaked in horse sweat from during the day. So they smelt the same, both horse and man. The spurs that are issued actually have little spiky ends. Many of the riders took those out and replaced them with sixpences because they knew they didn't need the spiky ends to be able to communicate with their horse.
By 1918, the Light Horsemen were still in the Palestinian desert, and the war is dragging on.
The heat is telling on the horses and on the men. There was restricted water. A lot of the men suffered kidney failure.
Many soldiers took box brownie photographs, especially during moments of respite.
And by the 30th of October 1918, the war is at an end. The armistice being declared on the 11th of November 1918 was such a relief, but it takes an awful long time to demobilise an army. And the men of the 2nd Light Horse did not get back to Brisbane until April 1919.
They rode through the streets of Brisbane and were greeted as heroes, especially on the horses.
And they just wanted to go back to their life. They just wanted it to be like it was before the war.
And I think what actually happens too is they come home to an Australia which is quite different to the one that they left.
You'll find that a number of regimental associations, such as the 2nd Light Horse Association, were formed, and on days like Anzac Day, they would gather together and they would swap their old war stories and they would rekindle their camaraderie. But outside of that, they often did not speak about the war. So every family had been affected. They knew someone that had been killed in their family, or they knew a family that had had a soldier lost.
No horses came back to Australia from the World War I effort.
In days to come, we'll wander west, across the range again. We'll hear those bushbirds calling in the green trees after rain. We'll canter through the Mitchell grass, breast the bracing wind. But we'll have other horses. Our chargers stay behind. Around the fire at night, we'll yarn about old Sinai. We'll fight those battles over again. And as the days go by, there'll be old mates to greet us. And the bush girls, they'll be kind. Still, our thoughts will often wander to those horses left behind.